a lot of that hippie flower child culture did bleed into the tech scene. San Francisco used to be a pretty normie, middle class, working class, Irish and Italian Catholic town, post-war boom, standard stuff. And in the 60s, the summer of love, the druggy culture, the Beats, Allen Ginsberg, all that now forms part of the S of nostalgia, came in the 60s and just never went away, right? And some of that led to, I would say, potentially overly permissive drug culture where people, they think about meth and fentanyl and these absolutely destructive drugs in the same way that you think about pot or something, and they're not obviously not the same, right? But on the other hand, they do allow all sorts of weird, trippy experimentation, like this guy named Stuart Brand who had this Whole Earth catalog, which was this very hacker ethos thing where you go live off grid and hack your stuff together. Steve Jobs claimed he was very influenced by it. A lot of that hippie flower child culture did bleed into the tech scene, and you see even today, right? And again, I would say, SF is a very permissive society in which traditional roles and traditional marriage and a lot of traditional things are just kind of suspended, and everyone lives in this sort of almost Peter Pan adolescent life, which again is kind of abnormal and strange in many ways, but I think is very fruitful when it comes to technology, right? Like a lot of the things we do on phones now, I remember, I'm old enough to remember 10 years ago was still odd, right? Like I heard the first Uber pitch and it seemed like a bad idea. It's like, why would you do this? Mind you, this is before drivers, it was a black car service at the time, right? Like it was a very small service. Or Airbnb, it's like, who the hell's going to let a stranger into their house? This is dumb, right? Or even Facebook's ad system, when I joined, didn't work very well. Like Facebook's ad monetization model was actually kind of poor, right? And so all these things got fixed and became normalized, but at one point they were radical and strange. There's only one place in the world that would even let you, entertain the notion that things would work that way, right? And San Francisco had that culture.
This episode of Invested with Antonio Garcia-Martinez was recorded in the summer before the massacre of October 7th and the war that has since ensued in Gaza. This war obviously irrevocably changed our lives, and therefore we've held off on releasing this episode. This episode was recorded at the height of the protests in Israel around the judicial reform and relates to some of the topics of that time. But it's a super interesting episode. We tackle why Antonio converted to Judaism, the tech scene in San Francisco, and the tension that exists between government and the high-tech sector. We think there's a huge amount of interesting content in this episode and think you'll enjoy it. It harkens back to a different time, but we're now ready to release it after a time period that literally has changed our lives. So please listen in to my conversation with Antonio Garcia-Martinez, author of Chaos Monkeys, founder of Spindl, and just an all-around incredible guy. Welcome back to Invested. I am thrilled to have Antonio Garcia-Martinez with me. He just landed in Israel not long ago, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. Rather than have me read off your bio and introduce you, would you introduce yourself?
Oh, God. Where to begin? I've lived a few lives. Let's see. I dropped out of a PhD program in physics at Berkeley, went to Wall Street, did Wall Street as a pricing quant at Goldman for a while, realized I didn't like Wall Street, went back to the West Coast, worked in tech, did a Y Combinator startup, sold that startup, was early at Facebook on the ads team, built some of their ad tech. Later on was an advisor at Twitter, worked in an attribution company called Branch Metrics, and then wrote a book called Chaos Monkeys, sort of a memoir of my time inside tech. Then I came back into tech, and right now I'm CEO and founder of a crypto company called Spindl.
Spindl without an E.
Without an E. I cheaped out. I didn't want to buy it with the E. It was too expensive. And so I got Spindl.xyz instead.
It feels like that could be like a Wheel of Fortune word at some point, but you're not going to find the vowels. So the thing we always open with is kind of what is your core personal value?
Oh, God. Wow, that's a real stumper. This is...
right out of the gate, we try hard.
This is Tyler Cohen levels of podcast difficulty here.
Have you done Tyler?
No, sadly, no. That's probably the one big podcast I haven't done, which is like the one I actually want to do, but I haven't done yet.
Tyler, if you're listening, please invite Antonio.
Personal value, man. I suppose it's somewhat contextual, whether we're talking a business or a personal context, I guess.
You can give us both.
I mean, look, I've just outsourced my morality to the Torah. I don't know. At this point, I'll just read off something from Exodus or something. I don't know. I think courage, intelligence. I can tell you the things that piss me off, the anti-values.
Go ahead.
Gross incompetence pisses me off. Hypocrisy pisses me off. I don't know. Being pretentious pisses me off. So, yeah.
Boy, if pretentiousness, gross incompetence, I guess a lack of courage or fecklessness pisses you off, these days and age, you must be pretty pissed off.
I know. A little bit. I try to stay off Twitter. But yeah.
You try to stay off Twitter and politics.
And politics.
So I read Chaos Monkeys before I knew you, when it first came out, actually, because I know a lot of the players
right.
In the book. It was courageous to write that book, I think is fair to say.
I think so. I was definitely a little worried. I actually, it's funny, I wrote it in Europe because I'm officially a Spanish citizen, and I thought, man, I'm going to get canceled for writing this book because no one's ever written like a tell-all memoir. Not that it was anti-tech necessarily. It was just like, this is actually what it is. And so, yeah, I thought I was going to piss off a lot of people. It wasn't that long ago, I guess 6-7 years ago. But it's kind of unusual to be that open about what you did at a large company back then. Now everyone just tweets anything. But back then it was kind of a little weird to do
it was groundbreaking,
yeah.
I would say. And no one knew what canceling, I think, was 7 years ago. Still early in cancel culture.
Right. It didn't even exist. I wouldn't have used that word then.
Right. But you're worried about it.
Again, I think it was, it's not anti-Facebook, to be clear. And in fact, in retrospect, it comes off as maybe pro-Facebook, or certainly appreciative of certain parts of the company's culture. But it was just an honest. This is what it's like to sit in a meeting with Zuck or Sheryl Sandberg. This is how big companies work. This is how the real startup ecosystem works. So yeah, I mean it pissed off some people moderately.
Why'd you do it?
A couple of reasons. One, as I detail in the book, there was there's all sorts of internal political machinations in my mid-level career inside Facebook. And then two, I thought the internet. Like, I'm old enough to be that bridge. I think we're both the same age roughly. To be that bridge generation that remembers the analog world before the internet, before, you didn't have the world's knowledge or the world's people in your pocket in a phone. And I thought 100 years from now, people will look back and say, what was it like when humans basically virtualized human life into the sort of digital domain? And they're going to ask and see what, there's going to be like a half a dozen books that people still read then. Let's make a bid to be one of those books and give like an honest insider take of what happens when you intermediate all of human social lives through a phone.
Yeah, but there were other ways clearly to tell that story, right? You could almost written an Isaac Asimov kind of sci-fi, or you could have just written a fiction book about that, and you could even have written it more anonymously. But this was like in the weeds. Just for what it's worth, by the way, I mentioned to my son, who reads a lot, that I was seeing you. He says, you never let me read Chaos Monkeys.
Oh dear.
So I said, well, I think now he's 18. He's old enough to read Chaos Monkeys, right? It was a rated R version of Silicon Valley.
It was a little salty, yeah.
It was a little salty. Yeah. You didn't have to write it that way, but you did.
Yeah. Not to externalize blame, but to externalize blame. My editor did push me to make it a little saltier than I kind of wanted, because obviously it's a personal tale, like it's the human story that makes people read it. And then the narrative voice, like, I love authors like Tom Wolfe, Hunter S. Thompson, these sort of edgy gonzo journalism, make the writer part of the story type thing. So it's not this dry reported nonfiction narrative. It's very much this spicy take of this kind of out of control person that I sort of was, I guess, part of the time. I wouldn't say it's 100%. It's not really 100% me. But yeah, it was a little spicy, but I think the personal is important. I had 2 kids in there. Yeah, the personal is important, but yeah.
Well, when people read the book, what should be their core takeaway?
Well, eventually they are, right? If they're getting into tech, I think the core people in tech who've read it have said, I think it correctly represents what that world is like. If you work in the ads and marketing world, which is a key part of Web 2, right? It's how the consumer internet gets paid for. They see ad industry in there. Right? So a lot of the book, sure, there's a lot of personal spiciness in there, but at its core, it explains how does Google make, hundreds of billions of dollars a year? How does targeting actually work inside Facebook, right? What data is actually valuable? How does a media business actually work? Those are actually some of the core themes in the book.
What I found interesting about the book as a tech insider, and by the way, as a guy who did what they called ad tech up until the early 2010s, and then I wrote a piece saying good Jewish mothers or good Israeli mothers don't let their great engineering sons go be ad tech engineers. What I found really interesting about the book was at massive scale, like Facebook, the decision-making, I would say, is even different than it is at smaller scale, which is some of the companies that I was on. Well, why do you think that is? Why does scale impact kind of even the ethical decision-making, I'd argue, in these cases of ad tech?
I mean, I would almost use like a physics analogy. And like, when you solve a physics problem, there's a notion of a heat bath, right? This thing that has so much energy in it, and you couple your system to that, and that other thing just doesn't change, right? Because it's like the universe or the galaxy or whatever, right? If you're a small startup, you have to think of the system as you being a small part of it, and your ability to influence that macro system is basically zero. You're a reactive, you're a reactive entity. When you're Facebook, you are the universe, right? You are the heat bath. And just in the same way that if you change the temperature, to cite a bizarre analogy, of the Earth 2 degrees, it would have these massive macro consequences. If you change the direction of the Facebook ship, now I'm mixing metaphors, even a few degrees left to right, suddenly everything shifts. So like one of the things I detail in the book, part of what I did at Facebook, was the first time Facebook actually joined to outside data and used outside data to target ads and try to monetize the user, was me, right? I mean, I pitched the story opens with me pitching Zuck and with a bunch of people, of course, saying, hey, we should do this weird thing where you retarget people inside Facebook, and it's never been done, and you don't quite understand what it is, and we don't really understand how we're going to build it, but let's do it, right? That, again, me as like a mid-level product manager, like I wasn't even that senior at Facebook or anything, right? And then said, okay, great, go do it. Here's 3 engineers, go build a programmatic ad exchange. That completely roiled the entire ecosystem, right? I had literally every ads company show up with their entire, senior management staff and walk me through the roadmap and basically say anything I want. Even though, again, I was just like some little lieutenant in Zuck's empire. And that's the thing, right? And suddenly we opened up this massive amount of inventory. Google had to take notice, right? There's a certain excitement to being inside a large company like Facebook. You can have, if you're in that in-between when it is a giant, but it's not so big that you're just one of a cast of tens of thousands. And when I joined, I was employee 2,000 or something at Facebook. There was maybe 20 some odd PMs, maybe 400 or 500 engineers. It wasn't big, but it wasn't that big, right? You could still have real impact on the company's direction, even though you're a relatively mid-level person. And that small times Facebook size is huge by outside size. So that's one way that the thinking is different. Facebook kind of creates its own reality. And it's good to think that way in the sense that you should try to create your own reality because Facebook creates the frame for its own products. On the other hand, that also means that you can live in kind of Facebook la-la land a little bit and not understand that the outside world, there is an outside world, and that often its rules are very different, which not anymore, but I think initially did plague Facebook's attempts at monetization.
Do you think like ethics and morals and values got a seat at those tables?
Yeah. In Facebook broadly, yeah, I think so. I mean, there's definitely a Facebook set of values, right? And there's all these posters that there used to be this thing called the Facebook Analog Research Laboratory, which, like a lot of things at Facebook at the time, was a sort of permissionless bottoms-up thing. It was basically a silk screening factory where you could print stuff. There was a print shop inside Facebook. Just some of the designers just started. And they'd print these posters that they put on the wall that would embody Facebook values. And some of them are now, I guess, kind of famous or at least infamous, like move fast and break things, which is no longer a company value. What would you do if you weren't afraid? Every day feels like a week. It's very sort of gung-ho sort of values, but, the company really did live them, actually, in a way. In fact, I've actually reproduced some of those posters, and I have them hanging in Spindl's office. I have some of my favorite ones. I go, yeah. We want to definitely channel the early Facebook energy.
Those are like ethos. Like, you said you outsourced your values to the Torah, right? Were there any kind of timeless principles in there that you think they said, man, because there's an outside world, we need some timeless principles to be able to anchor what we're doing?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, I think it was Keith Rabois' comment that every successful startup is a cult. Yeah. Probably true. And that's just the reality of it. And the cult of Facebook had those posters and other values as their values. I don't think there was a lot of, there was definitely no 10 Commandments, the eternal truths that they were following along. No, not really. Which doesn't mean they were unethical, to be clear, or immoral. I don't think that there was some outside moral reference standard that was being, followed.
You're spending more time now in Silicon Valley and you're kind of back. Has anything changed since the time you wrote this book?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, physically, a lot of things have changed, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the COVID hit the region, San Francisco in particular, pretty hard. The city just emptied out, right? And it still hasn't recovered, to be honest.
Yeah.
And
I was just there. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of things have gone wrong, both like law and order, local politics, SF, I keep reminding people, or I have to remind, there's a lot of young people in the startup now that like working with people half my age. I call them the Zoomers because they're sort of the Zoomer generation. It's fascinating to talk about Zoomers. It's like, you realize like 10 years ago in San Francisco, this was the center of the universe. Not only was it where all of like the consumer internet that Facebook, Airbnb, Twitter, like our office is on South Park, literally a stone's throw away from what Twitter was invented in one of the offices there, right? This is where it was all happening, not just technically, but also socially. Like San Francisco was as hopping and booming as, Soho in New York is now, or Tel Aviv or whatever. Like it was you felt like you were in the center of something grand and big things were afoot, right? And, I think other parts of the Bay Area are fine. Remember, Silicon Valley is not just San Francisco. Obviously, it stretches all the way to Menlo Park. It's a big stretch of land, right? I think Menlo Park and Palo Alto are probably doing fine, but San Francisco actually got pretty hard hit. And I think you're seeing a bounce back with AI. People are kind of moving back. I don't know. The way I reconcile myself to San Francisco, because a lot of it frustrates me, and I've wanted to move, but I have a kid there and stuff. You just have to think of it. It's America's petri dish, in which it's a fertile medium. The surrounding nature is beautiful, and just they'll sprinkle weird bacteria, and you'll see random stuff will grow out of this thing. And either it's absolutely destructive urban policies of a very radical sort of brand of politics, or it's autonomous vehicles. Like literally, you have. So Cruise has gone to like main production. I have the app on my phone. There are cars without drivers just zipping around San Francisco, and you see them all the time. And I think one of the most representative images of San Francisco in my head is that, and this is not like hyperbolic or a joke, you see this all the time, you'll see like an autonomous vehicle with no driver weaving its way around like a
homeless people.
So, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's like, man, this is such a dystopia. And that's kind of what SF is. Like this is a glimpse at a sort of
our future?
a certain sci-fi, book movie version of that future, yes.
But has anything changed in the ethos of Silicon Valley since you wrote that? I mean, let me maybe inappropriately make a couple of observations about the book. There was a large win-at-all-costs attitude that I think you are talking about at Facebook. At the same time, there is a high value placed on money, despite kind of, let's call it highfalutin ideals. Money talks, people walked. And people were counting. It's kind of how score is kept, I guess, on some level.
Is it? I don't know. I don't know that I'd accept that characterization.
That was one of my takeaways from the book. And then there's this kind of whole both political and social atmosphere on the outside that is a little unmoored, for lack of a better term. Has anything changed over the last decade?
Yeah. I think the whole quote unquote tech backlash that I'm putting in air quotes, because I think it was mostly manufactured, but at some point, if you manufacture media things, they become realities. The whole
manufactured by politicians, you mean,
or journalists, or just
yeah.
media in general. The whole 2016 Trump election, right, and then the whole anti-Facebook crusade with various trumped up, frankly, stories like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which
no
was
pun intended. Or pun intended.
What do you mean?
Trumped up?
Oh yeah, no pun definitely intended. Cambridge Analytica story, I think changed the view of tech, right? Like, I think at some point in there, in the last gaffes of real tech journalism, I think Recode, Kara Swisher's thing, or someone actually published like a negative sentiment study of coverage of tech over time, and you saw it dip negative in November of 2015, and what happened in November of 2015, the Trump election happened, and Facebook was credited with getting Trump elected, and suddenly tech was no longer exciting. People would forget that the tech journalists used to be kind of not exactly cheerleaders, but at least an appreciative audience that would kind of go to the same parties and hang out with the builders, and it would kind of be this very
Kara Swisher too. I mean, she put Jobs on stage with Gates, and it was this emotional thing. I was at that conference. I was in the room when that happened, and she was certainly a cheerleader along the way. She's obviously turned negative.
And she and everybody else has turned negative. Yeah. And so I think, there's been a real animus against tech, and I think that's necessarily, I think if you're an insider, that necessarily pushes you one of two ways. One, if you're like a normie tech person who, let's face it, not everyone is like a ketamine doing, Burning Man going, scooter riding, radical technologist guy. Some of them are just like with a guy who's a director at Google and he just has a job, right? Like it's pretty normie. That probably sours you on it maybe a little bit and makes you feel slightly embarrassed, and maybe you don't sit there and talk about your Google job on Thanksgiving. And then there's another half, and it's funny, Nadia did a great piece on this in Tablet recently, actually, speaking of Jewish organizations, Tablet magazine, about the tech civil war. You've got people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, who in some sense, I think, become more pro-tech, right? And more rejectionist towards the sort of mainstream. And I would count myself among them, by the way, of people who kind of reject. I just don't even talk to conventional journalists anymore. I don't care about them. I have no idea what's going on in the New York Times tech section, nor do I care, nor do I think it's particularly important. And so I just reject it. I think some of us just retrench into more pro-techness and more accelerationism, even though, I have reservations about tech that I express in the book and stuff. I'm not 100% pro-tech. But I definitely reject the reflexive anti-tech sort of vibe.
Let's dig for a second, though, now that you brought it up, into progressive politics and autonomous vehicles, right? It's like on one hand, kind of, I think there's a notion out there that extreme liberalism, let's call it, or progressiveness, enables creativity.
Yeah.
And it's good for creativity, but very, very clearly, and the data is very clear on this, the more progressive the mayors in the city, the more the cities deteriorate.
Yeah.
But like you said, autonomous vehicles are scooting around.
Yeah.
San Francisco, there's a lot of young people and AI growing up there. How do you reconcile that and what happens?
Yeah, I mean, progressivism, it's like the gas pedal on a car, and conservatism is like the brake pedal, right? And if you have nothing but one, the car just spins out of control, and if you have no brakes, I mean, how do you reconcile it? I think if you just take the historical perspective, there's this great book called Season of the Witch that's about the history of San Francisco in the 60s and 70s. And the short version of what happened is San Francisco used to be a pretty normie, middle class, working class, Irish and Italian Catholic town, post-war boom, standard stuff. And in the 60s, the summer of love, the druggy culture, the beats, Allen Ginsberg, all that now forms part of the S of nostalgia, came in the 60s and just never went away, right? And some of that led to, I would say, potentially overly permissive drug culture where people, they think about meth and fentanyl and these absolutely destructive drugs in the same way that you think about pot or something, and they're not obviously not the same, right? But on the other hand, they do allow all sorts of weird, trippy experimentation, like this guy named Stuart Brand who had this Whole Earth catalog, which was this very hacker ethos thing where you go live off a grid and hack your stuff together. Steve Jobs claimed he was very influenced by it. And so a lot of that hippie flower child culture did bleed into the tech scene, and you see even today, right? And again, I would say, SF is a very permissive society in which traditional roles and traditional marriage and a lot of traditional things are just kind of suspended, and everyone lives in this sort of almost Peter Pan adolescent life, which again is kind of abnormal and strange in many ways, but I think is very fruitful when it comes to technology, right? Like a lot of the things we do on phones now, I remember, I'm old enough to remember 10 years ago was still odd, right? Like I heard the first Uber pitch and it seemed like a bad idea. It's like, why would you do that? Mind you, this is before drivers, it was a black car service at the time, right? Like it was a very small service. Or Airbnb, it's like, who the hell's going to let a stranger into their house? This is dumb, right? Or even Facebook's ad system, when I joined, didn't work very well. Like Facebook's ad monetization model was actually kind of poor, right? And so all these things got fixed and became normalized, but at one point they were radical and strange. There's only one place in the world that would even let you, entertain the notion that things would work that way, right? And San Francisco had that culture, right?
And New York seems to kind of have it now also.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I wish I knew New York better. So anyway, the first blog post that I had go viral at AgRock, which is my YC company, was basically something dumping on New York as a tech hub, because I'd been there as a Wall Street guy, right? And I'd moved back to San Francisco, and the contrast was striking to me. Mind you, this was like 2008 or 2010 or 11. And so the New York tech scene hadn't quite taken off yet. Like basically they had Foursquare and like nothing else, right? I think it has taken off. I do think it's funny. People ask me about like, is Miami going to be a tech hub? Because I was raised in Miami. I think that sort of builder culture, like, is it a place where nerds rule? Put it that way, right? Like in San Francisco, you have an AI meetup and some space is taken over by 200 tech nerds talking about like large language models. That's a completely normal thing that happens literally almost every day of the week. Like that's the way the world works. Not to say that there isn't serious tech being built in New York, but there's just a lot of other things going on, right? And I think people just aren't quite nerdy enough. They dress too well. I don't know, they're too fancy. They know which fork to use in dinner. Like it's kind of different, right? Well, that form of tech awkwardness is welcome in San Francisco. The other thing, of course, is that San Francisco has like almost nothing else going on. There's no other serious industries allowed in San Francisco, right?
Right.
Tech can sort of take it over in a way that tech is never going to take over in Miami or much less in New York, right?
And what happens when the city actually goes worse to pot? I mean, I grew up in New York in the 70s and the early 80s. It wasn't a fun place, right? New York. It was a great place to grow up, but it wasn't safe. And, homeless people were all over the place and people getting killed and Central Park slashers and Bernie Getz that people have forgotten about. Like
I remember.
San Francisco's kind of like that now, right?
It is. I mean, I don't think there's any Giuliani on the horizon to fix it. Yeah, I mean, look, there's been some signs of life, right? They recalled Chesa Boudin, however they pronounce his name, who's literally the son of communist cop killers, and he didn't believe in prosecuting criminals apparently. And then the school board was also recalled. The school board basically closed the one high quality public school that a lot of SF youth used to have social mobility and get an elite education despite not coming from money, which I think we will all say is a good thing. They basically closed it down and made it not be a meritocratic school. So they did a lot of things that people disliked, and so they got recalled. But I don't know. It's strange. On the one hand, right, SF has been the scene of the biggest legal wealth creation possibly in the past 40, 50 years, if not human history. And yet you look at the city and it's terrible, right? And it just doesn't look like that. And
is that a societal problem? Is it a city management problem? Is it the way the world's going to look going forward?
Well, SF has been corrupt for a long time, right? It has the second largest city budget in the United States after New York, and yet it's a city of 800,000 people or something. Yeah. It's 7 miles with 7 miles. It's not very big at all. It has an enormous budget. It's not a money problem, and yet somehow it all gets siphoned away and nothing gets fixed. I have to say, I think tech deserves a little bit of the blame, right? I think for various cultural reasons that I've speculated on in other podcasts, it's not quite clear to me, but I think tech doesn't feel that sense of civic investment of, taking over the town in a good way, right? Like you go to the Met in New York and there's the whole list of little logos with every investment bank, every hedge fund, every aggressive hedge fund person has his name on a hospital or a museum or a school or something. And you go to the SF MoMA and Google isn't sponsoring the exhibit, are they? Or anything else?
What do you think that's actually an interesting observation. What's the civic involvement of tech companies and entrepreneurs?
I think they just don't feel they're part of the civic fabric. They just don't.
They did buy the basketball team.
Well, Chamath did.
Chamath's a tiny guy, but Joe Lakow brought it. Right,
okay. Yeah, and there are some philanthropy, right? There's the Benioff Hospital. It used to be the Zuckerberg Hospital before they took his name off it, I think.
I didn't realize that they canceled the hospital too.
Yeah, he donated, I forget what it was, $200 million. But during the whole post-Trump 2016 thing, they canceled Zuck. So they took his name off the hospital.
Right, welcome to the club, right? So, I mean, one of the things I think about is like the context of Tel Aviv, which I think, by the way, the entrepreneurs and the tech companies have actually taken a lot of responsibility in Tel Aviv. And I'm wondering, as you say that, why that's the case here. By the way, this is an incredibly well-run city.
Right.
Tel Aviv, incredibly well run with a budget surplus, too. And I'm wondering, you've got all the kind of tech thing here.
Because there's a social fabric, right? In California, it's always been kind of a gold rush town, right? In 1849, they discovered, for those who aren't familiar with history, they discovered gold, and it was one of the first cities developed because you could get there by ship, even before there was a railroad. And it's always been the town of people showing up and trying to make money, and the land of schemes and new beginnings and all the rest of it, but also a disconnectedness. Like you go to San Francisco, you make your bag and you kind of get out, or you move to Marin County, or you move to the peninsula, or you just leave and you move to LA or Park City, Utah, and ski or whatever, right? I don't know. I mean, Tel Aviv, from what I can tell, obviously there's Zionism, right? People are creating a startup nation. They believe deeply in it. And when I show up, people are always they love it when somebody shows up from Silicon Valley and comes to Tel Aviv, and I've had all these lunch invites in my time here, and right, it's just a very different feeling than I guess is a feeling of ownership, right?
Yeah, one of the things I've been saying actually is that the big difference between Israel and all these kind of places where the politicians and leadership has fallen away is that the civic society is actually much stronger here than it is, I think, in most places. Talk to me about Zoomers. That's a new one. I know I have this thesis to someone that one day is going to write a PhD thesis on people made investments over Zoom during COVID, and it ain't going to look very pretty. But tell me about Zoomers.
Yeah, so Zoomers, I think I'm using the right term, or Generation Z. I mean, the Zoomers are like the opposite of Boomers, right? In the sense that it's the youngest generation, which I think now is like teenagers to 25. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, you can look it up and see if I'm quoting the wrong age, but it's like the youngest employees that startup. And in theory, I don't know. I don't actually believe in this generational astrology, to be clear. But I do think that there are differences among, broadly speaking, generations. And so I don't know. They're always giving me new drugs, which is great. So there's this drink called Celsius, which has all sorts of weird serotonin precursor chemicals and caffeine, which totally makes you trippy. Some of them are on nicotine. Nicotine is a new drug now in Silicon Valley. People intentionally take nicotine because of focus. Yeah, I know. I've gotten pro-nicotine lectures from more than one person. I know it sounds weird, but the nicotine gum they use for people trying to get off smoking, they just take it as like a performance enhancing drug. I'm not joking. Yeah.
Okay.
Not to even mention they've legalized all these drugs in California. Like ketamine is now legal. Elon tweets about taking ketamine all the time.
I don't know what ketamine is.
Oh, it's I kid you not, like a horse tranquilizer, and it's and it's obviously used as a recreational drug, but it's actually gotten therapeutic proof. You can actually get prescribed ketamine in California now. I know, it's weird.
Oh my God. Well, I'm not worried about Musk being homeless, but the rest of the homeless people on fentanyl, I'm very worried about.
Yeah, I don't think it's nearly as addictive as that. but there's literally a ketamine startup called Mindblue. Not to plug it. I have no connection to it.
Yeah.
But it exists.
We wouldn't plug drugs on this podcast.
Okay.
I'm way too conservative with a small c for that.
Yeah.
When you said before, like so a line of drugs, it's like pot, and it's not like this. Like all those are the same for me. On the other side, but it's okay. Keep going.
No, but the cornucopia here is vast. They legalized mushrooms recently in San Francisco. You can actually buy chocolate with mushrooms on the street legally. With by the way, organic fancy chocolate as the chocolate. On the streets of San Francisco. They even have a loyalty card. I will confess, having bought one of these mushroom bars, you get a little loyalty card like you get in the sandwich shop where they click off the little numbers. You get one of those. I'm serious. This is what Silicon Valley.
This is what Zoomers are doing.
Yeah, this is what. Well, I don't know about Zoomers, but this is what San Francisco is doing. Yeah.
How'd you handle the backlash to Chaos Monkeys?
Oh well, I mean, when it came out, there wasn't much backlash. I mean,
backlash came later. We'll come to that in a second.
Yeah. Well, okay. No. I mean, the reaction was super positive. It was a month on the bestseller list. It was a book of the year, the summer, or whatever, by NPR, The Atlantic, Wired. It was super positive when it came out. I mean, it was considered a spicy book, but it was still a very positive reception when it came out.
And so then later, kind of, you had this little couple months stint at Apple that they canceled you. How'd you feel when that whole thing happened?
I've been in the media spotlight before. It wasn't that shocking an experience, I have to say. I think the people who, the joke on Twitter is like, the guy who's like everyone makes fun of on Twitter, like your goal is to not be that guy, right? So if ever the spotlight of Twitter is cast on you and you're like, somebody who isn't used to that sort of thing, right? Yeah. I think it could be like a shocking, traumatic encounter. I don't know. For me, it wasn't that shocking.
Wasn't a big deal.
Nah, it wasn't a big deal. Yeah.
You gonna write another book, by the way?
It's tempting. I mean, we'll see where this Web3 thing goes.
That'll be the topic?
I mean, potentially. I mean, someone needs to write a book about it, assuming it takes off and becomes a new internet. So there's no fixed plans, to be clear. People ask me this question all the time. There are no plans right now.
It could be called the Chaos Phoenix, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, I'd have to think about the title. Okay. Yeah.
So you've been canceled, kind of, from that experience, and you've spoken about this woke culture and wrote that, quote, this optimized for virality version of Christianity.
Oh, yeah.
Can you explain that?
Oh, yeah. Well, the whole wokeness thing, I mean, this is not an original coinage by any standard. I mean, Matt Iglesias, Andrew Sullivan, lots of people have compared, or Noah Smith more recently, have traced the origins of what we now call vaguely wokeness, which is admittedly a vague term, but you need a name for it, to sort of crusading Protestant Christianity, right? Of this, if you look at the original social justice movements, they were originally all religious in origin. That was true for abolition, the women's rights movement, civil rights movement in the 60s. Again, to be clear, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? A lot of these social justice movements were motivated and organized through churches. And so I think, one of the things that I definitely think is true, religion is conserved. Religion never goes away. It's just, it defines new and potentially worse forms of expressing itself. And so religion never goes away. Our putatively secular society has all sorts of religious dogma that it adheres to. And I think these days, in the tizzy of COVID, I think, it's sort of, at least in the U.S., which of course is still a very Protestant nation, it went crazy for this wokeness business. Yeah.
And so, you've kind of spoken out against this, and obviously your book, Chaos Monkeys, was a tell-all, right, to use your terms. And you said at the beginning that one of your core values is courage.
Yeah.
And brave. Where does that come from to kind of be able to cut against the grain like this? Yeah. And be able to be so contrarian? We've got this line at Aleph, but we just said that different is better than better. We try to be different. But you've really been out there and contrarian and brave. Where does that come from?
I mean, I'd like to claim that it was some sort of virtue, but I think, disagreeableness is actually, I forget whatever that framework is for human psychology. There's disagreeableness and then whatever the opposite is. You should probably tell him that I don't even know what the word is. But there's like neuroticism versus this, conscientiousness versus the other thing. So there's various axes you can rate human personality on. Mm. One of them is disagreeableness. I suspect it's either genetic or psychological in origin, right? Some people are just more contrarian. I mean, I don't know. Just being raised with certain values, I guess. Yeah, I mean, not wanting to be loved is another thing, right? I think most people want to be liked publicly, right? And so they're not willing to take that stand because I don't know. I don't really feel that urge. I don't feel the need to be loved.
Because what's more important?
Truth, maybe. Aesthetics, beauty, a well-written, engaging piece of literary nonfiction, right? Things like that.
Why'd you start writing, by the way?
Oh, it's funny. It's funny. Everyone thinks it's shocking in a way. I guess I've lived so many lives that it's weird when people see the transitions. My first actual paycheck in the United States was in writing. I was a city desk intern at the Miami Herald, which is the paper in Miami, and the Sun Sentinel, which is the paper in Fort Lauderdale, which is the city north of Miami. And so I was raised in Miami. And my mother was a librarian, so the house was full of books, and it was a very bookish culture. I was reading since way before school. And I always knew that writing would be part of it. I'd written op-eds and stuff. I've done creative writing workshops, although never taken them really seriously. I had pieces go viral. So my first YC startup, frankly, the most successful product was the blog. It would be number one on Hacker News. These things that would go viral back when it was rare for things to go viral on Twitter or Novel. So I'd have things go viral. And it's funny. It was in that the somebody working at the agency that became my literary agency discovered the blog post and sent me an email that I discovered only later was in my spam filter, actually. But anyhow, that's how I originally met my literary agent. Years later, when the startup had wrapped up, I decided to actually spend serious time on it and write the book. But I don't know, it was always waiting in the wings. I always knew that there'd be a writing component to my life.
Is writing important for everyone, you think?
I think it helps people distill their thoughts, clearly. I think it's hard to become a good writer. I think you can probably train to become an adequate writer. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my girlfriend claims that I wake up mumbling phrases, and like there's constantly language flowing through my brain in a weird way that's probably true for most writers.
Is writing going to be as important in this era of AI?
Oh yeah, more so. I mean, AI removes the middling and the mediocre, right? But if anything, I think the people on Substack who can actually manage to swing, 20,000 subscribers who pay them $5 a month will do even better in the sense that, like, if you automate away the sort of middling human component, the premium human component becomes even more valuable in a way, not less. And so I think for a subset of writers, we'll actually do very well.
By the way, why did you start writing for tablet, of all places?
Well, the whole Jewish thing,
We'll come to that. That's why. That's my segue.
So the whole Jewish thing. So I converted to Judaism a few months ago, to conservative or Masorti, as you would call it here. So I have 3 Jewish kids. The two mothers to my kids are all Jewish. And the third kid, I wanted the kid to go to shul and have a religious upbringing for a bunch of reasons, because I was starting to doubt whether secular liberalism really was the way forward. And she's like, well, the kid goes to shul, you have to take her. I'm like, okay. So I sort of called her on the bet. And COVID came, so it became kind of a COVID project to do all the study required for this. It was like getting a master's degree, basically. And of course, it being conservative, some of it could be done over Zoom, right? So like they'll actually live stream Shabbat services and stuff, which obviously Orthodox wouldn't do. So that's part of kind of why it happened. But yeah, and then the tablet thing, I guess, I don't know how I met Alana. I can't remember. Alana is the editor of Tablet.
Alana,
yeah. And Tablet, for those who aren't familiar, I would say probably one of the premier, if not the premier, sort of Jewish publications in the United States. I mean, there are other ones, of course, Mosaic and a few other ones. But yeah, and I think it takes, I'm not even sure Alana's denomination. But it's definitely not reform. But I think it's very sort of ecumenical, and the people who write, it's not all Jewish writers for starters, right? But I think it's definitely a little heterodox or dissonant, I guess you would say. It doesn't line up with the usual.
And not only Jewish topics, obviously.
Not only Jewish topics either.
Yeah.
But it is Jewish.
Brokenness and...
Yeah. But it is legitimately Jewish, right? You're not a Jewish organization unless you have the date in the Hebrew calendar, and then you have a PDF version for Shabbat that can be printed out, right? That defines you as a real Jew. So it definitely has that. But yeah, it's not just Jewish topics, actually.
So you mentioned before that kind of religion seems to get conserved; it doesn't go away,
yeah,
right? And you also said before that wokeness per se was kind of a religious ethos run amok, on some level, and yet you converted to Judaism.
Yeah.
What was about Judaism?
Yeah.
That attracted you, other than the mother of your children saying, "Hey, they need a babysitter in synagogue."
Right. I mean, there's a couple of reasons, right? One thing is the pro is the why, is the attractive aspect of Judaism, and then so I wrote this piece called "Why Judaism" that should have been in Tablet, but ended up not being. I still regret it. It was in my Substack called The Polar. Actually, sorry, they republished it with the second piece. Sorry, now I remember. So you can find it on Tablet. And then I wrote a second piece, somewhat cheekily titled "The Moses Option," about also why I converted, also on Tablet magazine. And so, one thing is just secular liberalism, the sort of, it's not even just necessarily wokeness. It's the blah, globalist, whatever, left of center to Western political default, right, is a little empty, and there's sort of a God-shaped hole in the middle of it, right, that's not being filled by much of anything at this stage. And so it's sort of rejection of that. Also, Judaism obviously beautiful for a bunch of reasons, right? I get into in the piece. I think that my first piece coincided with Simchat Torah, actually. And so, the joy of this very textual society that conserves its text, that is the tree of life, so to speak. It's like the title of your book. And it appealed to me in a deep way. Obviously, a very scholarly, bookish religion. An orthopraxic religion about the practice, less about the faith, right? And less, it's not a personal relationship with God or Jesus or whatever. A lot of aspects of it were interesting. And I think Judaism is very adapted to modernity in many ways, right? Like,
explain.
Well, there's this whole, I don't know how much you listen to Balaji, right? But like the whole notion of the network state, the notion that there's this, federation of loosely associated, kind of elite cities where everyone does their thing, right? Like the Jews were the original network state. Obviously, the diaspora was the network state, right? That the rest of the world is only catching up to.
Now, like Balaji, there's like an Indian network state as well. Between Silicon Valley and India itself.
Yeah. And so, like the notion of a very abstract, cosmopolitan, decentralized state is nothing new to Judaism. Obviously, that was Judaism for 2,000 years. So in that sense, I think it's very suited to modernity. I think the other thing is that I don't know. This is a more theological question, but Christianity. I was raised Catholic, right? So I first read the Torah. I wouldn't have called it then. Then the Old Testament in translation in a Jesuit school, which had like the scholarly annotated edition, and I just found the Old Testament or the Tanakh a lot more interesting than the New Testament for a bunch of reasons. And even then, obviously, Christians acknowledge this as well. There's a huge contrast between the God of the Old Testament and the Torah and the Tanakh and the Gospels. There's a huge difference, in fact, to the point that many Christians call it a new covenant, right? Mm-hmm. Like the old contract is null and void. We have a new contract. There's clearly the counterparty. It's a very different, God. And so, yeah, I think something about, I just started seeing the world in a more Jewish way. It seemed as if my personal Bible ended at with Chronicles at the end of the Tanakh, and that's it. It didn't begin with, I can't even remember anymore, Matthew or Luke, whoever the first gospel is. So yeah, I sort of ripped out the Gospels from my personal Bible. And I don't know if we want to go into the details of what I find objectionable about Christianity or not, but I don't know, I can.
Sure, if you want.
Christianity is interesting, right? I've often joked that Christianity is Judaism with product market fit and a growth team, right? That's basically it, right? They basically managed to popularize, it's like Mac OS 10 versus Linux, right? Linux is unusable and never became the desktop, but you put a nicer UI on it and suddenly it becomes a Mac and everyone uses it, right? And so that's kind of what Christianity did with Judaism, right? It's basically this unauthorized religious offshoot. And it takes a lot of Jewish ideas and in many ways it overexpresses them in many ways, the messianism and all that. But then it has new ideas that don't have a lot of precedence in Judaism. So for example, the victim is divinity, right? It's very strange when you walk into a Christian church and here is this tortured criminal on an instrument of torture just hanging there dying a gory death. That is the vision of divinity, right? Again, as a Christian, you're so used to it, or even the West, you're so used to it. It's strange, right? Most religions don't have that as a symbol, right? And the unique thing that Christianity did was reverse the moral order, right? Traditional religions, not Judaism, but just broadly, worship the beautiful, the strong, the wealthy, the powerful, right? They worship the superlative, and Christianity, in some sense, inverted that and said that actually no, the sick, the ill, the ugly, that is where divinity lies. It's in victimhood in some sense that we uplift that into divinity. And I think that sounds very noble in a way, but it can also go off the rails in a big way, right? Which I think is a lot of what you're seeing now. And in fact, some of Christianity's biggest fans, Rene Girard, who, Peter Thiel's a big reader of him. I think Girard was a genius in a way. The way that he understood the myth of Christianity and what it did for a lot of these pagan religions. And even in his own book, actually, he describes that, never Christianity has created a level of victim worship unprecedented in human history, right? And I don't know. I think I reject that worldview. And I think the other thing is Christian and Jewish notions of justice, I think, are very different. And to me, you're seeing a lot of it now, right? Like in a lot of the traditionalist right, and a lot of it exists only online, to be honest, of reverting to paganism or like rejecting the Christian message, right? It's as if the Christian world goes between two poles, the weird overweening victim worship of Christianity, and then the bizarre pagan revolt against that. And I don't know, there's a middle road, which is sort of Judaism.
And what do you think is the role of religion in the future democratic states? David Brooks had this piece, I forget the title of, I think it was in the Atlantic, about the kind of overly liberal order. That's after, of course, he wrote about the no need for the nuclear family. And he's kind of talked about how liberalism, quote unquote, with a small L, I guess, has gone over the line and it's devolving society and become devoid of religion. By the way, he made the opposite conversion than you did. He went from Judaism to Christianity.
I know.
And what is the role of religion in this kind of increasingly secular world? By the way, it's a question I get asked a lot when I give speeches.
again, I think religion is just there. It's just that it doesn't exist as such. I think one of the reasons for religious education, I'm glad I was sort of raised Catholic with the Jesuits, who took a very scholarly approach to it, is that you can recognize religious thinking right when you see it, and it doesn't always come wearing literally a priest's robe or a kippah. It's religious thinking, right? I think it was William James who said in The Varieties of Religious Experience that at its core, religion is the thought that there's some moral order to which human society should converge, right? That there's some unseen abstract order, which of course is, if you take a totally materialist, physicalist view of the world, is insane. Like, why would there be, right? Like, I believe in science as much as the next guy. I think to me, they're just orthogonal spheres of life, science and religion. But it is irrational. Why? I mean, even the secularists, what is human rights? What would show me human rights in a microscope? Doesn't exist, right? It's a human construct. And to the extent that you revere it and that you inject into your society and you claim that this is the good to which we should all be converging, you're talking like someone who believes in religion, right? This is an abstraction that doesn't really exist. And so I don't know. I think what David Brooks is saying is that at the end of the day, he likes formal religion, right? So I think that's what he's objecting to. That there aren't structured forms of religious thought, and that if anything, that's the bulwark against unstructured and kind of random and potentially bad forms of religious thought.
Right. It also seems to say that a society devoid of religion will inevitably spiral downward. That seems to be his latest argument. You agree with that?
I think a society needs some metaphysical language to talk about the world, right? And if you don't, just asking the question, what is good in life, right? How should I live as a person in this society? To what ends should society be striving? To what ends should we sacrifice for, either when it comes to human life or money or anything else? If you can't ask those questions about yourself and comes up some sort of answer, you're not going to function as a society.
Let me ask you of you. Yeah. What is good in life? What would you sacrifice for?
Well, again, I think it depends a lot on the context. I mean, I don't know. It depends on the context. I mean, I think one of Israel's strengths is that Zionism answers that question, right? The Jewish state is a good, as we should all be beholding. Although clearly people disagree about how to build it. I was at the protest yesterday, and obviously there's a lot of disagreement about how to build that. But at some sense, the end state is kind of in mind. I'm not sure that in the U.S., for example, most Americans would have a clear answer as to what is the good that we're trying to build.
What's yours?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. At a personal level, who cares, right? But I don't know. At societal level, again, Israel to me is interesting because it was, like the U.S., founded as like a startup. It was an invented nation in a way, right? And
I call them both covenantal nations.
Right, exactly. They're both covenantal nations.
Yeah.
Although in the U.S., again, I don't know that most people will even accept the document anymore or even accept what the details of the covenant are. So yeah, no, I mean, the U.S. is obviously a reboot, in many ways, a secularized form of Judaism, right? Here you have, it's a sacred document handed down by prophetic founders and interpreted by this rabbinical court, right? It's the most kind of Jewish thing ever, right? And that's why politics seem like religion in the United States, because they become almost theological disputes.
Yeah.
Right? And something like, abortion or gun control assumes the proportions of like Sunnis versus Shiites, or like literally a religious splinter group, right?
You mentioned before that Judaism is the original network state.
Yeah.
But when you converted, you were asked, will you support all those who seek to reestablish and revitalize our Jewish homeland by making the state of Israel part of your life and the life of your family? And you said, I do.
Yes.
Isn't that the anti-network state?
Yes. So that the question you're asking, just for context, that was literally the questions in the Beit Din that the rabbis asked me, which is part of the standard conservative script, I think.
Yeah.
My rabbi just plucked it out of a book. And it's funny, the editor who edited that tablet was like, who I think is Orthodox, was shocked that they would still even ask that in this day and age in the United States, given that Zionism these days is somewhat more controversial in the United States. But, I agree with you. But yeah, of course. But, that's that's the struggle between diaspora Judaism and Israeli culture, right? It's like, and you've seen this forever, right? I was just reading back a book by, I forget who it was, either Micah Goodman or somebody, and just about, when Zionism, or no, I think it was Walter Russell Mead's book about the Ark of the Covenant about the Israel in the United States. Before Israel was founded, Zionism was not popular in the United States. On the contrary, it was very anti-popular. New York Times, the Salzburgers did not support Israel at all.
Right. By the way, in Europe also, even with many Orthodox Jews, even the most of Orthodox Jews, it wasn't popular. Yeah.
Right. Because in the U.S. case, they felt, well, our new homeland is the United States. Like that, we're assimilated citizens here. There was still anti-Semitism, but not nearly as much as Europe. This is our home. Israel doesn't speak for us. And in fact, I remember I was reading, I can't remember what book it is. I read too much Israeli books and media as it is. But during the Eichmann thing, when the Mossad nabbed Eichmann and dragged him back, many Jews in America actually objected. They're like, who appointed Israel as the great avenger of the Jewish people? And why are they doing this? And obviously at the time it was extrajudicial and whatever. Yeah, there's a real tension there between, I mean, look, we're going to see it next week is Tisha B'Av, and we're going to go to the Kotel, and we're going to see the Temple Mount, and we're going to lament the destruction of the temple, and can't we go back to Jerusalem? And yet there's going to be an Israeli policeman standing there in Temple Mount. Well, what are you talking about? Jews control Temple Mount. Now, what are we lamenting, right? In some sense, that is the diaspora over, or is it not? Who really speaks for Judaism? Is it the rabbis on the Upper West Side? Or is it people right here in Israel? I don't know. It's a real
I grew up
tension.
on the Upper West Side. I have a very clear answer to that question.
What is the answer?
I'm here.
You're here.
I'm not sure it's the rabbis at all. How's that? I think it's the people.
Okay.
By the way, I don't know, just a side point. Did you ever read the book, The Great Partnership by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, where he talks about kind of the marriage or partnership of science and religion? I guess you wouldn't subscribe to that necessarily. You think they're orthogonal?
I just think they address different questions. It's just... I'm literally as pro science and math as the next guy, possibly more. I just think there's a metaphysical plane. You're not going to get the answers to what is a good life, or
biology doesn't answer all our questions.
It doesn't at all.
Yeah.
And the problem is somebody who thinks that actually becomes frankly dumb about metaphysics or morality or philosophy, because if there's nothing in your epistemology, if how you discern truth is only an empirical exercise, then you have to warp reality to make the fundamentally metaphysical argument that you're making, right?
And by the way, since science is evolving, right? There's a thesis, and you have to prove it out, et cetera.
Right.
It's kind of consistently evolving. There's nothing that's a truth, quote unquote.
Right. I mean, science is like an intellectual dialectic. It's not like a book with the answers. And so, yeah, I think they're just very different. Science is not was it Carl Sagan who wrote that book, The Demon Haunted World, right? That in some sense, the God of the gaps. Science, religion exists in the gaps that science has. And I'm like, I think those gaps will always exist, right? It's not, if we had a more powerful microscope or a higher energy, particle collider, then religion shrinks. It's like, no, it won't actually.
Actually it gets bigger.
Yeah, if anything, it might get bigger.
Yeah. So talk to me about Spindl. Let's shift gears entirely.
Sure.
Tell us what Spindl is and why you decided to take your talents, to use the LeBron James line, from the world of Web 2 to the world of Web 3.
Yeah, some people might be asking, like, what the hell is Web 3? So this is this whole world of the blockchain, which if you talk to a normie, if they know about blockchain, they think about it in the context of cryptocurrencies.
I love the fact you use the word normie like this.
Yeah, it's like the non-tech people, the civilians. Yeah, so this is all happening on this thing called the blockchain, which is a very different way of building, information technology, right? And what's different about it is that something like the blockchain, it's not just about Bitcoin. It's not just about value transfer, although that can be part of it. It's the fact that it's one of the main blockchains called Ethereum, and it's known as the Ethereum virtual machine. And what that means is you have a network of world machines that do the computation of the network. And that code and that data lives on this thing called the blockchain, which is basically just a chain of state that all these computers keep in memory. And you write a thing called a smart contract, which is literally a piece of logical code, similar to computer code that runs in other places, except it's running on this global computer on the blockchain. And that smart contracts makes claims about the world, such that Mike Eisenberg owes me 1,000, right? Or I went to a decentralized exchange and bought a thing that represents the value of Google shares, something called a synthetic, because you mimic an equity on chain or something, right? And that is a claim in the world that the network of computers will say, yes, this is truth. And if I sell it for 1,000 ETH, then, which is a large sum of money actually, then I get that in my wallet, this thing called a wallet, which is my representation on this chain. So that is the world of blockchain. And you can do lots of stuff with that. And it goes way beyond Bitcoin, which again is just like sending money. It's like, no, this is literally a contract about the world. I'm saying a thing, right? What can you do with that? Well, you can run financial exchanges. You can run things like banks, things that look like banks, or things that look like exchanges. You can also do things like NFTs, digital ownership, right? Like I own this beautiful painting and the rights to it, literally I own the digital rights to this thing exist on chain and I can sell it or buy it, which sounds very strange, but it's really not that different than the disembodied form of the fine art world.
Yeah, I have a certificate of ownership, except this time it's proven digitally.
Right, exactly. And you could also build things like games, right? So I have games. Virtual goods are a big part of many games. And you trade things inside World of Warcraft or as the case may be, and that exists on chain. And I can actually own that in a way that I can sell it to you outside of the scope of the game, right? Even if the game shuts down or whatever. And so that's what Web3 is, right? There's a notion, Chris Dixon, who's a partner at 16Z, has a book coming out and it's called Read, Write, Own. And that's how he traces the history of the web. So Web 1 was read. You publish a thing, it's like the basic internet. I go to a site, I read it. Then there's write, that's Web 2. it's Twitter, it's Facebook. Like, oh, I'm a little guy, but I've got my following and I publish my thing and people follow me. Then there's own, which is I actually own digital assets. The way I see it is, if you imagine a world, if you imagine an economy, meaning banking, equity, financial instruments, NFTs, ownership, if you're to re-engineer that for a fully online virtualized economy, one that didn't start with, fax machines and checking and all the rest of it, what would it look like? It would look like crypto looks now, right? We need a programmable way to assert things about the world in a decentralized way and exchange value, and that's what the blockchain world does. Anyhow, long story short, that's this whole Web3 thing, and the idea there is that you can build a consumer web on top of that. So I can build a game in which I own the gun or the sheath or the helmet or the whatever, and that's actually mine, and I can sell it or I can rent to somebody else. There could be you could lease your NFTs and make revenue on your NFTs. There's a whole banking sector around in-game virtual good that all just sprouts up around the blockchain, right? And it's just a different way of building the internet. So I got kind of crypto pilled. I had lots of friends in crypto, and what have I done for the 10 plus years? Ad systems, data, human attention, turning all that into money and measuring it. Measurement on the internet is super important. One of the early promises of internet advertising is you can actually see who saw every ad, and then eventually converted, religious pun intended, I think, from the marketer's perspective, and actually bought the thing or did the thing, and you can actually tie all that together. And that whole world is called attribution, and it feeds a lot of what happens on the advertising or the media side. So I start talking to crypto companies. I got some intro to gaming companies, and nobody knows what's going on. They literally have no clue. Where are users coming from? I have no idea. Well, how are they monetizing inside your experience? No idea. We can't even calculate our revenue. How long are they sticking around? Are you retaining users? I mean, these are all very basic growth metrics that everybody in Web2 knows. We have no idea. How much did it cost to acquire them? I don't know. But we did this thing called a token drop, where we basically give money away to get people to use the product, and it cost us this much, but we have no idea if it was actually effective or not. And it drove me crazy. I could not understand how this world could be run in such a dumb way. And so I set out to fix it. How do you build and measure things? Like, how do you know if you click on a thing and then you go to that protocol and you spend money inside their product for 2 weeks later? How do you tie it all together and know that, yeah, actually this Twitter influencer tweeted a thing and that's what actually drove this user, so therefore, we should pay that influencer something. Like, we basically built the technology that does that. And it sounds kind of boring, but it's very important plumbing. And it's the foundation for any sort of real media ecosystem that will ever get built in blockchain.
Every media ecosystem has attribution and measurement, and this is attribution and measurement for blockchain or crypto, as the case may be. I remember back in the, like you said, we're both about the same age. In the old .com days, it was the same thing, and basically venture capital money covered up for sloppiness in this business in the late '90s in the .com, and call it in the 1920, 21 era of crypto. Now you get to the other side of it, and someone actually needs to measure this. And it ain't going to be Nielsen, and it's not going to be DoubleClick or Google Ad. It needs a whole new system for it. By the way, if you had to explain blockchain to my mother-in-law, what's the one-sentence description of blockchain?
Oh, man. It'd be hard to explain to a grandmother.
My mother-in-law, if she's listening, is very intelligent, but still.
Yeah, I mean, the one metaphor people often use is that it's a global ledger, right? Yeah. People understand a ledger, like a system of accounts. It's a system of accounts that everyone can read and write to for a fee, for a network fee. And that's the basis for how various entities collaborate. I guess I would use a ledger analogy because people probably understand.
It's kind of the hard part about blockchain is it's part collaboration, part proof of ownership. And then it's also composable, right? So you can kind of constantly change it, yet it's immutable at the ownership level. And
but that composable thing is worth lingering on for a second. So that's that one's a little harder to explain.
Right.
But what composability means is that I can put one of these pieces of code called a smart contract that does a thing, right? It's literally a set of function calls that do a thing. And if I'm willing to pay what are called the gas fees, the fees.
On Ethereum, it's called gas. On other networks, it's called something else. But
right. Basically, I pay the fees that get the nodes to do the thing. I can then write to the chain or it's easy to read. It's cheap to read, but hard to write. I can do things on chain. The cool thing is that it's composable in the sense that it's like Legos. I can build something on that smart contract. So, for example, in the decentralized finance world, there's a lot of, again, protocols that are kind of wonky, low-level things that let you buy this derivative or whatever. I can create with no permit, like, again, permissionlessness is another term of art in this world. I can take those smart contracts and build a user-facing product that actually trades in those protocols without even talking to the company, right? I can, as long as I'm willing to actually pay the gas fees, and those will, of course, get passed on to the user, I can build a better UI on whatever that underlying protocol is And they're actually fine with it. It's like, fine, you want to build on us, go ahead and do it. As part of what we do, we have a reward system. So if you come in and do a thing, we will pay the person who drove the action. That's part of what the product that we offer. People can take that smart contract and build on it if they wanted to. If they wanted to build the publisher network that drove traffic to our smart contracts, in theory they could, right? And so that's kind of a part of the magic of the blockchain.
I try sometimes to describe to people, and would go decentralized finance or DeFi. Try creating your own derivatives financial product on top of Goldman Sachs's, mainframe or server system. You can't do it.
You can't do it,
right? And so gas or ETH is just a different way to pay for the infrastructure,
right?
And you don't have to be Goldman Sachs in order to do it. Anybody can do it, and so it's democratized the ability to get access to those great compute systems and to be able to just kind of one layer on top of the other, build on other people's work, also to go do that. I want to ask you another question about Spindl.
Sure.
Like, why'd you go back
and
start a company?
Well, I mean, somebody who's going to get rich doing this might as well be me. I mean, I don't know. That's the reality of it. I mean, it's just like, it's so obvious that this needs to exist. Like, there's no question that in 5 years, there will be attribution on Web3 and it'll be $1 billion business. Now, it's still open question whether it's going to be Spindl or not, but there's no question. Assuming Web3 takes off and maybe it all goes away and this was like the biggest, failure in tech history, but I don't think so. I think
Are you in the office or remote?
Kind of half and half. I don't believe in full remote, to be honest.
Yeah.
I believe in working in person. So about half the team is remote. But, we have a live work crash pad thing with bedrooms and stuff. So often the remote people come in on a regular. In fact, next week it's going to happen. They're going to come back in.
So you transitioned from, Facebook, social media attribution now to Web3. You think we're at the end of the era of social media?
Well, I mean, look what's going on with Threads, right? So Facebook started with the biggest social network in history, launched Threads, which is like kind of an okay product. It peaked at whatever 70 to 100 million active accounts, and now it's crashing, right? Like it's dying. No, I think there is not like large Web3 social media yet, but I think humans are never going to stop talking about and to each other. That's never going to end. That will never end. And I think Facebook itself, Facebook.com is getting a little old. Mm-hmm. I think WhatsApp is hard to beat. I mean, I was at these marches in Jerusalem yesterday. I was with one of the organizers. It all got spun up in like a few days on WhatsApp.
It's unbelievable.
WhatsApp. There was literally no planning except WhatsApp. It was incredible. It was this huge mass of people. It was nuts. So I think WhatsApp is going to be hard to beat. I don't know. I think something in Web3, some decentralized version of social media will definitely take off, I think.
Long-term, Twitter or Facebook, who wins?
Define winning.
Who's the bigger company?
Oh, Facebook.
Facebook.
But the most influential company?
Yeah.
I think it already is Twitter.
And you think it has staying power too?
Yeah.
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 What does the Web3 version of social media look like, by the way?
There's a couple of examples. So I'm a tiny investor in a company called Farcaster, which H16Z-backed company. They're basically Twitter on the blockchain. I guess is the simplest way to explain it. It's a microblogging service, if you can still use that term, and it exists on the blockchain. It's an open protocol. You can build a viewer on top of it. There's another one called Lens, which is a similar concept. There is some social media out there, but the adoption has not been great. I mean, it's solid adoption, to be clear, but it's not Twitter scale yet. I don't know. I suspect when Web3 consumer really takes off in a big way, we're talking 10 million plus users, it'll probably look a lot like Web2. It'll just have fascinating functionality that you couldn't generate in Web2.
And maybe differentiated ownership, right?
Oh, yeah, sure, probably. But it'll do magical things that you couldn't engineer in Web2 and yet just work naturally and are actually super appealing to consumers.
The question I have to ask you is someone who writes and somebody who opines on religion and somebody who is part of the Lincoln project, right?
Yeah.
So politics. So you're and a tech
network, Lincoln Network.
Sorry.
Which, by the way, and they rebranded. Actually, they're no longer even called Lincoln Network.
Okay.
Right? But yeah, it's for explanation. It's a DC policy org that's like about technology and stuff. Yeah.
And somebody who's kind of what I'd call long tech, short mainstream media, and kind of full into the acceleration.
Yeah.
So we're in this moment of kind of clash between tech and DC or tech and politics, right? AI is one topic of it. Crypto was a big topic, although
still is a little bit. Yeah.
Well, the FTC took a beating, I think, recently, appropriately so, in my opinion, and the SEC is also kind of teetering on this topic. Where does this go? Like, Silicon Valley is like the whooping boy of many people in Washington. On the one hand, on the other hand, it's now, by the way, by market cap, the most important industry on the planet. How does this work itself out over time, and what happens over the next year or two?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is inevitable, right? I think technology is inherently destabilizing. I think crypto particularly so, right? Like decentralization is literally a value in crypto. Like DC is bad, right? There's another way of saying it. So I don't know. I think this has always been the case. I think tech is really bad at making a case for itself. Like I was part of this like DC like sort of lobbying think tank thing, but like a running joke in DC, I'm a little bit in that world, and I'm still in a couple groups with DC people, is that the tech lobby groups are terrible. Like literally Google and Facebook, some of the smartest, most well-funded people in the world, are less effective than some like no-name healthcare company in Pennsylvania you've never heard of, who has got their boy in the house and gets whatever bills they want passed and do not get pushed back and get treated like royalty, right? And like, why can't tech do that? I don't know. I think tech is bad at selling itself to non-tech people, I think is part of the problem. And then part of it is just a huge target, right? Like you said, the top, 4 or 5 by market cap companies are tech companies.
But look at this. Cambridge Analytica changed the face of politics in America, and Facebook did too.
By perception alone, but yes.
No,
yeah.
Come on. Every new change in media changes the way politics is done, right? America started with pamphlets, ended up,
or political advertising, you mean? Yeah, sure, of course.
Right,
yeah.
That's changed. And those are powerful places to be. And by the way, controlling the narratives on Twitter, which is what every news mainstream media anchor starts with in the morning, is what did so-and-so say on Twitter, right on Twitter, is a big deal. And these are privately owned companies by, tech titans right now. And, you've got autonomous vehicles, which is going to need regulation. And you've got crypto, which is decentralized and threatens the centralized financial system. I mean, we're headed for a even larger clash over time. And, by the way, technology used to destabilize religion. Now it's destabilizing politics faster than it's destabilizing religion, as best I can tell.
Yeah.
In fact, I'd say there's something of a religious revival now around technology, but politics and DC is threatened. So are we just going to be in like these wars between DC and tech for the next years?
Yeah, but we just need to accelerate.
They're going to get worse.
Yeah, probably. But it's fine. Just move faster, and then they're just slow to react, and then by the time they catch up,
will that impair democracy, though, for example?
Nah, I don't think so.
No, you don't think so?
It'd improve it, if anything. No
By the way, is democracy the best system for governance in this accelerated age?
Hard to say. I think it depends. Obviously, it depends on local context. Not every country is a democracy, right?
Yeah.
I don't think every country can be a democracy.
Would you move to a different country even if it's not a democracy? Because to accelerate tech?
Probably, no. I would not make the China trade, no.
Not just China. There are other countries that aren't democracies or less democratic, right?
Yeah, no. No. I think, democracy has come to mean a lot of things in the West, right? Yeah. And often what it really means is sort of secular liberal universalism is what it's come to mean.
Yeah.
Right? You can have all sorts of democracies that are not necessarily the most liberal state in the world.
But democracy, I think at a basic level, Natan Sharansky, who was the great refusenik, right, a hero of mine, said that it's the ability to stand up in the central square and say whatever you want.
Yeah, of course.
It's a reasonable definition, right?
Sure. Yeah, I agree, yeah.
So you wouldn't leave that behind for anything? Not even for acceleration?
But to be clear what we're talking about, but even they're conflating a little bit. What he means is human rights, the right to free speech.
Freedom.
Right.
Samuelson famously said that free markets create free societies. I think it's the opposite, by the way. It's that free societies enable free markets. Where do you come out on that?
It's probably a little conjoined.
Conjoined, all right.
Yeah. But democracy thing is kind of interesting. I mean, anyhow, it's too much local politics. I won't say the thing that comes to mind.
Come on, say it.
No, well, it's funny. I was at this demonstration in Jerusalem yesterday, and these are the pro-democracy protesters, but they're actually protesting a democratic process, right? They're breaking up a parliamentary vote. I don't understand. If you're pro-democracy, this is democracy. So is it only democracy when you win? I mean, if anything, it's an anti-democratic measure having a Supreme Court would nullify parliamentary measures, right?
Yeah.
But it's strange. They don't really mean pro-democracy in the sense of voting. They mean pro-democracy in the set of a set of values that they think that they're using the banner of democracy to sort of flog their own beliefs. But it's I remember there was a headline somewhere in there I saw that pro-democracy protesters are dragged out of the Knesset. It's like, do you not see the irony? The pro-democracy protester is interrupting literally the democratic process, right? And so, but of course, they don't literally take it to mean democracy. They take it to mean a set of values that they think that they're sort of fighting for, and maybe they are. But anyhow, democracy can mean a lot
of things.
Yeah.
What motivates you to get out of bed every morning? What does it come out? Rapid fire question.
Oh, probably the 9 o'clock stand up, which is going to happen in half an hour. to
go. What makes you human and vulnerable?
Oh, human and vulnerable. I mean, the same thing that makes everybody human. Flawed reasoning, being overly emotional, being stuck in some rut of psychology. I mean, that's the human condition. Yeah.
So you probably won't write your own biography or autobiography, would you?
No. I always joke. I'm not really a narcissist. I just play one on the internet. I'm not really nearly as self-absorbed enough to actually do that. I mean, Chaos Monkeys arguably was, I guess, kind of an autobiography, but it was really more of the focus wasn't really on me, the person. It was on like everything else going around me.
And it's a timepiece.
Right, exactly. It's using me as a mirror to a reality, but it wasn't really about, like, my individual story didn't matter that much. I was emblematic of a time and a period and a thing going on. So like, would I write another one of those maybe about crypto? I mean, who knows? Potentially.
I'm an author also, but if I wrote your biography, what should it be titled?
Oh God, I don't know. Mistakes were made.
Mistakes were made. Well, this is great. Thank you, Antonio, for doing this.
Sure.
You can learn more about Antonio Garcia-Martinez on Twitter. He is at ANTONIOGM. His book, Chaos Monkeys, Obscene Fortune and Random Failure in Silicon Valley, is available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please rate us 5 stars on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen. And not just that, please tag Tyler Cowen and tell him that Antonio wants to go on his podcast.
Absolutely do that.
All right. Thank you, Antonio.
Thanks, Mike.